I watched my son Brian stand at that podium, diploma in hand, thanking everyone who made his success possible. He mentioned his professors, his mentors, his new fiance's family, even his stepfather Carlos, for believing in him when no one else would. What he didn't mention was the $200,000 I'd scraped together from my dead wife's life insurance and my entire retirement fund to pay for that very diploma he was holding. My name is Andrew Jackson, and at 58 years old, I thought I understood what sacrifice meant. 3 years of watching my wife Sarah waste away from cancer taught me about loss. Working double shifts at my auto shop in Toledo while she fought her final battle taught me about exhaustion. But nothing prepared me for what real sacrifice actually looked like until my son Brian got that acceptance letter to law school. Sarah had always dreamed Brian would become a lawyer. She'd grown up poor like me, but she had this vision of our boy in a courtroom, wearing a sharp suit, making arguments that mattered. "He's got the brains for it, Andrew," she'd say, watching him ace another test in high school. "He just needs the chance we never had." Well, she got her wish, even if she wasn't around to see it. When Brian opened that acceptance letter from Northwestern Law, his hands were shaking. Mine were too, but for different reasons. The tuition number at the bottom made my throat go dry. $200,000 over 3 years. That's more money than I'd see in a decade of fixing transmissions and changing oil. But here's the thing about being a father. Logic doesn't enter the equation when your kids' dreams are on the line. I looked at that number and thought about Sarah's last words to me. "Make sure he gets his chance, Andrew. Promise me." So I made a decision that probably looked crazy to anyone with common sense. I took every penny from Sarah's life insurance payout, $150,000 that was supposed to be my safety net. Then I emptied my retirement account. Another $50,000 I'd been slowly building for 26 years, of crawling under cars and getting my hands dirty. The bank officer looked at me like I'd lost my mind when I explained what I wanted to do. "Mr. Jackson, this is your entire financial future we're talking about. Have you considered federal loans, payment plans?" I had considered them. But Brian was already stressed about the debt load, already worried about graduating with crushing payments. I wanted him focused on his studies, not on money. Besides, what was I going to do with retirement anyway? Sit around, missing Sarah? The weird part is, I felt good about it. Proud even. When I handed Brian that check to cover his first year, the look on his face was worth every sacrifice. He actually cried. My tough kid, who hadn't shed a tear since his mother's funeral, was standing there with tears rolling down his cheeks. "Dad, I can't let you do this. This is everything you have." "It's an investment," I told him, "in the smartest person I know." Those first few months, Brian called home twice a week. He'd tell me about his classes, his professors, how hard the workload was, but how much he loved it. He'd thank me again and again, always ending our conversations with, "I'm going to make this worth it, Dad. I promise." Then something started to change. The calls became less frequent, once a week, then every other week. When he did call, he sounded different, more polished, I guess. He'd use these legal terms I didn't understand, talk about professors like they were celebrities. Don't get me wrong, I was proud he was learning, growing. But there was this distance creeping in that I couldn't quite name. His visits home became shorter too. Thanksgiving break turned into just Thanksgiving Day. Christmas meant 3 days max before he had to get back to study. He'd sit in our tiny apartment above the shop, checking his phone constantly, like he was anxious to be somewhere else. Makes sense, right? Kids growing up, finding his place in the world. But something else was happening that I wouldn't fully understand until much later. Something that would change everything between us and set the stage for the biggest betrayal of my life. That distance I mentioned, it had a name, and that name was Carlos Mendoza. Carlos wasn't technically Brian's stepfather. He'd married Sarah's sister Elena 2 years after Sarah died. But somehow, somewhere along the way, he'd become the father figure Brian turned to for everything that mattered. And honestly, I couldn't blame my kid for being impressed. Where I had grease under my fingernails, Carlos had manicured hands that had never touched anything dirtier than a legal brief. Where I stumbled over words when Brian started talking about constitutional law, Carlos could match him argument for argument. The man was a successful immigration lawyer with a downtown office, expensive suits, and connections that stretched all the way to the state capitol. When Brian brought Carlos to one of his law school events, something called a networking mixer that I didn't even know existed, I watched them work the room together. Carlos introduced Brian to judges, senior partners, people who could actually help his career. Meanwhile, I stood by the punch bowl wondering what the hell a tort was and why everyone kept talking about them. "Your uncle really knows his stuff," Brian said afterward, and I noticed he didn't mention me at all. But the real shift started when Brian met Isabella Hartwell during his second year. The Hartwell family made Carlos look middle class. Her father was Judge William Hartwell, a man whose name appeared in newspapers and whose opinions shaped actual law. Her mother came from old Connecticut money, the kind where they don't even talk about wealth because it's just assumed. Suddenly, Brian's calls home weren't about classes anymore. They were about dinner parties and weekend trips to the Hartwell family estate. He described their library, bigger than your entire shop, Dad, and their wine cellar, and their connections to senators and Supreme Court clerks. The first time Isabella visited our little apartment above the shop, I knew I was in trouble. She was polite enough, don't get me wrong, said all the right things about how charming and authentic everything was. But I caught her looking around with this expression like she was touring a museum exhibit called How Regular People Live. Brian was nervous the entire time. Really nervous. He kept apologizing for things that had never bothered him before. The narrow stairs, the smell of motor oil that drifted up from the shop, my worn-out recliner that I'd had since before he was born. "Dad fixes everything," he told Isabella, but the way he said it sounded more like an explanation than pride. Then came the dinner invitation. The Hartwells wanted to meet Brian's family. All of it. That meant me and Carlos and Elena, sitting around their dining room table that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. Carlos brought wine. Good wine. The kind with a French name I couldn't pronounce. Elena brought flowers arranged by an actual florist. I brought myself in my best shirt, which was still obviously from Walmart, and a growing sense that I didn't belong anywhere near this place. Judge Hartwell asked about Brian's background, his influences, what shaped his interest in law. Natural questions, the kind any father would ask about his daughter's serious boyfriend. But here's where things got interesting. "My Uncle Carlos has been invaluable," Brian said, gesturing toward Carlos like he was presenting evidence in court. "He showed me what a legal career could really look like. Open doors I never knew existed." Carlos smiled modestly. "Brian's incredibly talented. I just provided some guidance." "And your father?" Isabella's mother asked, turning to me with polite interest. "What's your background, Mr. Jackson?" The table went quiet. Not awkward quiet. Expectant quiet. Like everyone was waiting to see how this piece of the puzzle fit. "I'm a mechanic," I said simply. Because what else was there to say? "Oh, how interesting," Mrs. Hartwell replied with the kind of enthusiasm people use when they're trying really hard to be nice about something they don't understand. That should have been it. Simple question, simple answer. But Brian jumped in like he was performing damage control. "Dad's always been great with his hands. Very practical. But honestly, Carlos has been more of a mentor when it comes to my actual career path. He's the one who really understood my potential." The conversation moved on. Carlos talked about recent immigration cases. Judge Hartwell discussed Supreme Court decisions. Brian engaged confidently, using language I barely recognized from the kid who used to help me change brake pads. And I sat there, eating their expensive food off their expensive plates. realizing that somewhere along the way, I'd been written out of my own son's story. The signs kept coming after that. Brian's internship at Carlos's firm, arranged through Carlos's connections. His invitation to join the law review, recommended by professors who knew Carlos professionally. Even his job prospects, every interview, every opportunity seemed to flow through Carlos's network. "He's got the golden touch," Brian told me during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "Everything Carlos touches turns to success." What about everything I touched? What about the $200,000 that made all of Carlos's mentoring possible in the first place? But Brian never seemed to make that connection. In his mind, Carlos was the one who believed in him, guided him, opened doors. I was just the guy who happened to be his biological father. The engagement announcement came through Elena, not Brian. She called to tell me the news, excited and chattering about wedding plans, and how perfect Isabella was for Brian. When I finally got Brian on the phone, he sounded happy, but distant. "We're thinking next spring," he said. "Small ceremony, just family and close friends. Carlos is going to walk me down the aisle." That hit me like a punch to the gut. What about me? Well, you'll be there, obviously. But Carlos has been such a father figure these past few years, and Judge Hartwell specifically requested, "It's complicated, Dad. Carlos just fits better with their world." Their world. Not his world. Their world. Like he was a visitor who needed the right guide to navigate unfamiliar territory. But here's what Brian didn't know. What Carlos didn't know. What none of them knew. I still held all the cards. Those weren't traditional student loans Brian had. They were private arrangements I'd made, secured against my own assets. Legally speaking, Brian owed me every penny, not some faceless institution. I'd kept quiet about it because I never planned to collect. It was my gift to my son, my investment in his future. But watching him hand credit for his success to everyone, except the person who actually paid for it, that changed things. Graduation day was coming, and something told me Brian's speech wouldn't include any mentions of greasy mechanics or life insurance payouts, or fathers who believed in dreams they couldn't even pronounce. But I was about to remind everyone exactly who made this fairy tale possible. I sat in that auditorium listening to my son thank everyone, except the man who actually paid for his education. The applause died down, and Brian stepped off that stage, looking like he owned the world. Carlos was beaming in the front row. Isabella's parents were nodding approvingly. And me? I was calculating exactly how much interest 24 months of betrayal should cost. The reception afterward felt like walking through someone else's dream. Brian worked, the crowd with Isabella on his arm, introducing her to professors and classmates as his future. Carlos held court near the punch bowl, telling anyone who'd listen about Brian's upcoming position at his firm. Brilliant young mind. He kept saying, "I knew from day one he had what it takes." What it takes. Right. I found Brian by the dessert table, finally alone for 30 seconds. Time for a conversation that was 3 years overdue. "Hell of a speech," I said. He looked genuinely surprised to see me. "Dad, thanks for coming. I know this isn't really your scene." My scene? The words came out sharper than I intended. My son graduating law school isn't my scene? Brian glanced around nervously. "That's not what I meant. I just meant all the formal stuff, the ceremony. You know how you are with crowds." How I am with crowds. Like I was some kind of social defective instead of the guy who made this whole party possible. "Interesting thank you list in your speech," I continued. "Very thorough. Hit all the important people. Look, if you're upset I didn't mention you specifically, there were time constraints. I couldn't thank everyone individually." Time constraints. But somehow he'd found time to praise Carlos for believing in him when no one else would. That particular phrase was still echoing in my head like a broken record. When no one else would? I asked quietly. Brian had the decency to look uncomfortable. Carlos opened doors for me, Dad. Introduced me to the right people. This is a relationship business. And the money? Who opened their wallet for you? That's different. That's just, that's what parents do. Just what parents do. Like scraping together $200,000 was as natural as packing a school lunch. Like emptying my entire future was just another Tuesday. Carlos appeared beside us with perfect timing, probably sensing tension from across the room. Andrew, congratulations. You must be incredibly proud. Proud doesn't begin to cover it, I replied, looking directly at my son. 3 years of investment finally paying off. Carlos has been amazing. Brian jumped in quickly. The mentorship, the connections, everything. I can't imagine navigating law school without his guidance. Guidance is important, I agreed. Though, I suppose tuition money helps too. An awkward silence settled over our little group. Carlos cleared his throat diplomatically. Well, Brian certainly maximized every opportunity. Natural talent combined with hard work. And funding, I added. Don't forget funding. Brian's jaw tightened. Dad, can we talk about this later? Actually, we should talk about it now. Especially since you're getting married soon and starting your career. Time to discuss some practical matters. What practical matters? Here's where things got interesting. The loan terms. Brian looked confused. What loan terms? I thought you paid everything outright. I did pay everything, outright. But the money came from private loans I took against my assets. Legally speaking, you owe me the full amount. $200,000, plus interest. The color drained from Brian's face. That's not possible. You said it was a gift. I said it was an investment. Investments expect returns. Carlos stepped forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in. Andrew, surely you don't mean to collect from your own son. Depends on the son, I replied calmly. If he's the kind of son who acknowledges sacrifices and shows gratitude, then no. But if he's the kind who rewrites history and hands credit to someone else, well, that changes things. Brian was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. You can't be serious. Dead serious. You want Carlos to be your father figure? Fine. Let him pay for the privilege. You want to pretend I had nothing to do with your success? No problem. Just pay back every penny I invested in that fiction. Isabella appeared at Brian's elbow, sensing drama from across the room. Everything okay here? Brian looked trapped. Carlos looked uncomfortable. And me? For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I had everyone's complete attention. Just discussing Brian's student loans, I said pleasantly. Amazing how these financial details work out. Brian's new world was about to meet his old reality. What happened next wasn't pretty, but it was necessary. Brian tried damage control first, pulled me aside, promised he'd make things right after the wedding. Said he was just nervous about fitting in with Isabella's family. The usual excuses wrapped in lawyer speak. But Isabella? She had questions. Real questions. Brian, you never mentioned owing money to your father. Her voice had that crisp edge rich people use when they smell financial problems. How much are we talking about? $200,000 sounds different when you're planning a wedding budget, especially when your future mother-in-law starts calculating how this affects the prenup. Carlos tried playing mediator, suggested family counseling, maybe a payment plan. Andrew, surely we can work something out that benefits everyone. Everyone already benefited, I told him, except the guy who paid for it all. The next week changed everything. Brian showed up at my shop looking like he hadn't slept. Isabella's family wanted documentation, proof of the loan terms, legal clarity before moving forward with wedding plans. They think I lied to them, Brian said, slumping in my office chair. About my background, about being debt-free. Did you lie? Not exactly. Didn't mention certain details. Certain details. Like his entire financial reality. Judge Hartwell called me personally. Very polite. Very professional. Also very clear that his daughter wouldn't be marrying someone with undisclosed debt. Nothing personal, Mr. Jackson. Just prudent family planning. The job offer at Carlos's firm. Suddenly on hold pending. Resolution of personal financial matters. Brian was learning what I'd known all along. Money talks. Everything else walks. But here's the thing about being a father. Even when your kid breaks your heart, you still want what's best for them. I didn't destroy Brian's future. Instead, I gave him a choice. Public acknowledgement, I told him. You stand up at that wedding, assuming it still happens, and you tell everyone exactly who paid for your education. You thank the mechanic who believed in you when his wallet was all he had to offer. Brian stared at me. That's it. Just acknowledgement. That's everything. He made his decision at the rehearsal dinner, stood up in front of Isabella's family, Carlos, everyone who mattered in his new world, and told the truth. My father sacrificed everything for my dreams. Every penny he had. He believed in me before I believed in myself. The room went quiet. Then Judge Hartwell started clapping. Slow at first. Then everyone joined in. Isabella looked at Brian differently after that. Not worse, better, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. They got married 6 months later. Brian walked himself down the aisle, but I sat in the front row. Where fathers belong. Sometimes love means letting go. Sometimes it means holding on. And sometimes it means teaching your kid that respect isn't negotiable, even when everything else is.